Hey y'all, it's Mr. Hill, and for these videos that I'm going to be putting together for y'all, I'm going to focus on presidential stuff. We are in a presidential election year currently. Of course, it feels like presidential election years because it's been going on since like 2016. This presidential election has been going on since 2016. The one before that had been going on since 2012. The one before that since 2008. It's like we're in a constant state of presidential election, which can be exhausting unless you're a nerd like me and then you kind of enjoy that kind of stuff. So that's what these videos are going to be about. So in this first video, we'll be talking about some kind of overview stuff about the presidency and what the president does, what their job description is, and like qualifications and those kinds of things. So let's see. The big essential question is, does the current electoral process result in the best candidates for president? Which is an excellent question, especially if you look back not too long ago to 2016. You had for the Republicans, Donald Trump, and for the Democrats, Hillary Clinton, categorically, undeniably, the two most unpopular presidential candidates of all time. So the question is, were those the best two that we could have come up with? I don't know. So in section one, the first video that we're going to do today, what are the roles and qualifications for the presidency? In the next video, what occurs when the president is unable to perform the duties of office? Next video, how did the process of choosing a president change over time? Fourth video, does the nominating system allow Americans to choose the best candidates for president? And then the last video that I'm going to be doing for y'all, does the election process serve the goals of American democracy today? So section one, the president's job description. A few objectives. Number one, describe the president's many roles. Understand the formal qualifications necessary to become president. Explain how the president's term of office has changed over time, and describe presidential pay and benefits. Several terms, and they apply to each of the president's roles that they take on, all the different hats that the president wears. So let's talk about those roles. The president acts as chief of state, the ceremonial head of the U.S., and the symbol of the American people. The way that I like to explain this, if you think about, if I ask any of y'all or anybody off the street, hey, who is the leader of Great Britain? Most folks are going to say the Queen. And yet, the Queen doesn't actually do anything. She sits around, she's famous, she gets to wear nice clothes and have beautiful children who get married to other beautiful people who have beautiful grandchildren for her. And I guess she gets to have tea and crumpets, which I'm sure is lovely. But she doesn't actually do anything. She has no legislative role or executive role in the United Kingdom government. So in this way, the president being the chief of state, that role for the president of the United States is similar to the Queen of England in that if you went to Spain or Mongolia or Brazil or somewhere and said, hey, who's the leader of the United States? The first person they're going to say is the president. They're almost a ceremonial figurehead for us as a nation. Next role, the president is the chief executive. So as far as being the chief executive, this means that the president embodies the executive powers as laid out in the Constitution in Article 2. So any of those powers that the president has access to, that's the chief executive role. And predominantly what this means is executing the law. So executive power, executing the law that Congress comes up with. That's the president's job in this role. The president's also the chief administrator. So this ties in with that previous role too. They direct more than 2.7 million civilian employees of the executive branch. So just like at school, the principal is the chief administrator, make sure the bills are paid, make sure that we've got enough teachers on staff, any of those kinds of things. The president does a similar job for the nearly 3 million members of executive branch agencies. Folks that work for NASA, folks that work for the FDA, folks that work for the post office. The president, if you go all the way up those lines from low-level, entry-level employees to managers to middle managers to regional people to the Secretary of State, the Postmaster General, the Attorney General. Ultimately, it gets to those cabinet level positions, and then ultimately, the president is the boss of like 3 million people that work for the government. The president is the nation's chief diplomat, and that means that they basically design American foreign policy and are the de facto spokesman to the rest of the world. Again, whenever people in other countries see anything on the news about the United States or any kind of like press conference or anything like that, it's usually the president themselves that's doing that speaking, that's doing that information gathering or information giving, excuse me. This is probably the most famous role that the president has. They are the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. It doesn't matter if they have any actual military experience or combat experience, they still call the shots for all those men and women that serve in military roles. So the president can, if they don't have any experience, obviously surround themselves with admirals and generals and folks that have like served a lifetime in the military and probably know a bunch of strategy and things like that. But they don't even have to do that. They could teach themselves a lot of stuff. Think about like Abraham Lincoln, 16th president. He didn't have any military experience, and he had a whole dang civil war to go through. So what he would do is just get a bunch of books on military strategy and techniques, and he just studied. Like, he Googled how to be a military leader before there was Google. But he was able to pull it off, and obviously the Union won the Civil War, which is why we are still one country even today. The president is the chief legislator. So this is a little confusing. Let me explain. The president does not make laws. That is not the president's job. That's Congress's job. They are the legislative branch. That's the lawmaking branch. The president's job as executive is to execute the laws that Congress came up with. Now, having said all of that, the president can and does propose laws. The president can set the congressional legislative agenda through things like the State of the Union address. So most of the laws that Congress actually comes up with are based on ideas that the president comes up with. So I don't know if the president, President Obama, Obama had come up with, the outlines of the Affordable Care Act known as Obamacare. That was his idea. He did not make that law. Congress made the law. They fine-tuned it. They figured out the ins and outs of that law, but it was Obama's idea that they took and converted into law. The president's the unofficial head of the political party that controls the executive branch. So they're the chief of party, the party leader. If you pointed to one figure today that, if I said, who is the leader of the Republican Party, most folks would point to Donald Trump. If I said, point to the leader of the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi, maybe? Bernie Sanders, he's not even a Democrat. So the party that doesn't have the White House is almost leaderless, or at best they have like multiple leaders, which if you have a bunch of leaders, do you even have any leaders? For the party that's in power, that has the White House, they can point to that person that's in there and say that's the leader of the party. And then this is an unofficial role. All these, I guess, are unofficial. The president is the chief citizen. The president and vice president are the only offices that we all have a say in as Americans. It doesn't matter if you're in Mississippi or Montana, if you're in New York or New Mexico or anywhere in between. We all get to vote and have a say in presidential elections, which means They are a de facto representative of all of us, which is probably part of the reason why people tend to obsess over presidents and presidential elections. The president doesn't have tons of direct impact on your daily life. Congress has a lot more impact, but even they don't have as much impact as, say, your state and local government officials do. They're the ones that are really doing things that impact your day to day. The president doesn't. However, that's the one politician that, I mean, it doesn't matter where you're from in the entire country. Everybody can talk about the president because they're everybody's president. We all voted for that president. Well, I say we all voted for that president. We all voted in that presidential election. We have a vested interest in it. As far as formal qualifications, there are 3 requirements for president. You have to be a natural born citizen of the United States. What does that mean? There's actually debate. Obviously, for most of our history, it's been taken to mean you must have been born here on this dirt in order to qualify for president. However, that's not actually ever been like tested like in a presidential election or in the courts. For instance, if you go back to 2016's Republican Party primary for president, you had Donald Trump, obviously, and then like 50 other people running for the Republican nomination. One of them was Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Now, the interesting thing about Senator Cruz is that he was not born here. Where was he born? Of course, senator from Texas, last name Cruz, your first thought is like Mexico, which is not a bad guess. He was actually born at the opposite end, in Canada. Ted Cruz is Canadian-ish. Well, how is he able to run for president? He's natural born, whatever. His mom was American. So he argued, and the courts basically backed him up, that allowed him to meet this qualification. So you have to have been born here or mostly here in order to meet that qualification. President must be at least 35 years old. So if you think about it, 35 is not super old. Now, I know if you're in the 10th grade or whatever and you're watching this and you're sitting there thinking, oh, it's pretty old. No, it's not really that old. I mean, I'm just over that, and I don't feel like I'm that old. Back in the day, that was kind of old. I mean, life expectancy back in the 1700s was like 50 or 60 years old. So if you were 35, you were starting to enter the twilight of your life on this planet. As a result, there was probably a lot of life experience and wisdom that you had gained at 35. When you think about people today, obviously life expectancy is a lot longer. It's more than double, 35 years. But that requirement is still the same. You must be at least 35 years old. We've never had a 35-year-old president before. We have had some young people run. Most recently, if you go back to the Democratic Party primary from this year, 2020, much like the Republicans in 16, there were 100 Democrats running for the party nomination this year. We had a couple of young ones. You had Pete Buttigieg, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He is 37. If he had won the nomination and then gone on this November to win the presidency, he would have been the youngest president we've ever had. You also had Tulsi Gabbard, who is a representative from the state of Hawaii. She's 39, maybe. Also would have been the youngest president ever. As it is, the youngest president we have ever had is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was 42 years old when he became president after the president before him was assassinated. TR was vice president for William McKinley. McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Teddy Roosevelt steps up to become president. The youngest president we have ever elected was JFK, John F. Kennedy, back in 1960. He was 43 years old when he was elected. As far as oldest presidents, the oldest president we have ever elected, Donald Trump. Donald Trump was 70 when he was elected back in 2016. Now, kind of the trick question, similar to the other one, the oldest president we have ever had was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was 78 years old when he finished his second term in 1988. So, got to be at least 35 years old. The president must have been a U.S. resident for at least 14 years. So how does that not count under the first one we talked about? So you can be born here and then move to another country and come back. The point is you have to have lived here for 14 years at least. Is that all together? Can it be spaced out? I don't know. It's whatever. It's got to be 14 years. Now, as far as terms in office, technically, the Constitution doesn't have any term limits for the presidency, at least as it was originally written. George Washington set the tradition, set the custom of serving just 2 terms. Why did Washington only serve 2 terms? He had literally, been a subject of the King of England. He didn't want, and a lot of other Americans and founding fathers didn't want, for the United States to basically devolve back into a monarchy. Washington didn't want to be the king of America, in other words. So he wins his first term, serves it, wins his second term, serves it, and then walks away and sets a tradition for future presidents to follow. FDR, pictured here, shattered this custom because he was elected in 1932, in 1936, in 1940, and again in 1944. That's 4 presidential wins. If he had survived his 4th term in office, he would have been president for 16 years, which is as long as some of y'all have been on this planet. That's a long time. So, basically, because FDR had won 4 straight presidential contests, the 22nd Amendment was proposed and ratified in 1944, and that places a term limit on presidents. Presidents can serve no more than 2 full elected terms in office. If a president succeeds to the office after the middle of the term, then they can still seek 2 full terms. So in this example, let's say you're the vice president, you and your president are elected, and then they die or quit or something right in the middle of that term. So you can finish out those 2 years left as president. Then you can run for and win 2 terms of your own for a maximum of 10 years in office. But you can't serve any more than that. So, in that example, if the president dies just 1 year into office, and you assume the presidency, you get to serve those 3 years left, and then you can run for a term of your own, but not another one. Why not? Because then you would go over 10 years in office, and that's not allowed. As far as views on term limits, many people, including some presidents, have argued that the 2-term rule unfairly limits the right of people to choose their president. There have been many presidents, I say many, there's been several, that have said that, they would have loved to have run for a 3rd term. Ronald Reagan would have loved to have continued being president, but he was forced out of office by these term limits in 1989. Similar story with Obama. Obama would have probably won in 2016, but again, he was term limited. He had to leave office in January of 2017. Supporters say the amendment protects against the abuse of executive power, which is a great argument to make, especially if you're like the Republicans were back in the 30s and 40s. You've watched a Democrat, FDR, win 4 straight. You don't want to see the bad guys win over and over and over. So if that's the situation, you probably like the term limits because it allows for the possibility of power changing parties. Some people have argued for a single 6-year term, which would free the president from worrying about re-election. It's a neat idea. If you think about it, say Obama, for instance, he basically started running for re-election in like 2010. He had only been on the job a couple of years, but re-election was coming up, wanted to keep the White House. So if you had a single 6-year term, you only have to worry about being elected once. then you're kind of free to do what you feel like you need to do as president, which could, I don't know how that might look. It would be interesting to say the least. As far as pay and benefits, Congress decides the president's annual salary, and it ain't LeBron money. Just so that you know, this salary cannot be changed while the president's in office. How much money are we talking about? $400,000 a year, which is a lot of money. I'm not saying it ain't a lot of money, but it's surprising because you think about like actors and athletes and musicians, and they're making millions of dollars a year, and the president doesn't even make $500,000 a year. Even if you throw in a $50,000 living expense stipend, make it $450,000 a year. That's still not nearly as much as some of these celebrities make. I mean, even a backup quarterback in the NFL makes about this much money every year. The Constitution forbids the president from receiving any other pay from the government or the states while in office. This is part of what they call the emoluments clause, which means that presidents basically can't be getting paid double, either through government or other kinds of conflicts of interest. Other benefits: the president also receives access to Air Force One, which is a presidential jet, as you can see here in this photograph. The president can literally control the country from 30,000 feet in the air, which is pretty impressive. They have access to the White House, which is a 132-room mansion on 18 acres of prime real estate in the middle of Washington, D.C. Very nice. Camp David, which is the presidential retreat. It's exclusive for the first family and invited guests. Lots of cars, fancy cars that have fancy gizmos and gadgets. I'm sure it's, very James Bondy if you really got down to it. Large staff, lots of offices, excellent health care and other fringe benefits, pension, retirement, that kind of stuff. And that's it for section 1 and this first video. Tune in for the next video where we talk more about president stuff.